is a KRON-4 Decision 2008 special.
Keeping everybody out, I think, until pretty much the last minute, and then people are going to come in. Some of them will be ticketed, some of them won't have tickets, but you're right, they're saying up to 1 million people. Look who's here. Jim O'Connor, our political analyst. Happy Election Day, James. Short night, long night, what do you expect?
It should be a relatively early night, I think, in terms of getting a solid direction on which way we expect this race to go. As soon as the East Coast closed, there's so many states that are really key mathematically to McCain's electoral victory if he is going to pull this out.
We'll know right away, actually.
I think we're going to have a very clear indication after the entire East Coast closes.
So it will certainly shift the electoral map depending on which states McCain gets, which states on the East Coast Obama gets. But let's talk about Indiana, since we're going to be getting some real numbers from Indiana soon. Talk about the importance of that.
Indiana's key, and it's interesting because the state has gone Republican just about every presidential race going back to the 40s. Or maybe LBJ.
Since LBJ,
okay,
yeah.
Then my history is a little bit off. But it's a state, as Chris mentioned, where Evan Bayh, the senator from Indiana, was really looked at and put on one of the top lists, the short list for vice presidential nomination. For Barack Obama, and one of the reasons was that it would pull it over to the blue column. It's also neighboring Illinois, so a lot of the feed over from Illinois and the news that Obama gets there bleeds over, so it should be very friendly. If Indiana switches blue tonight for the first time in however many years it's been, it's going to be a really clear indication.
It could be an indicator of the night to come. Hey, by the way, Missouri is a big bellwether state.
Yes.
They say that state has picked every president that eventually would win since 1904, with the exception of 1956 when it went for Adlai Stevenson. So, but what else are you looking for tonight, Jim, as results start coming in?
Again, looking back on the East Coast, we're going to be eyeballing Pennsylvania. It closes a little bit later than these first couple states, but it is on the East Coast block, and that's going to be mathematically, again, very, very key. That's one of those large states, the big states. If you think back to when Hillary Clinton was running against Barack Obama, she had this big state strategy. Pennsylvania was definitely one of those, and McCain is going to need to hold on to those electoral votes. We're going to watch Florida. Florida always plays key in these presidential races, going back to 2000, certainly 2004, it was a big player. Indiana, North Carolina, and Virginia, who have been trending more Democratic, but are still Republican. It's going to be a lot of states, but they're going to come up pretty early.
And of course, a lot of the Senate races, which are very key to the balance of power in Congress, are going to be, we'll be finding out about those as well pretty early on, and Kentucky being one of them. Senator Mitch McConnell, who's the minority leader in Kentucky, grew up in politics in Kentucky from county commissioner on up. He's the Senate minority leader, and he is fighting a very tough race in the state of Kentucky.
Really fighting for his political life tonight. A lot of the really well-known, high-profile senators and House members are in these epic battles that they really never thought they'd be in. Part of it is the economy becoming a dominant issue. Part of it is just a really bad year to run as a Republican.
And GOP legend Elizabeth Dole in North Carolina is apparently, well, polls suggest she's behind, facing an upstart Democrat and in some trouble. And that could be an indication of what's happening.
In Minnesota, you see Norm Coleman, the sitting Republican senator,
up against Al Franken,
from Saturday Night Live, which has really loomed large in this election.
Yeah. I also mentioned about Florida. Charlie Crist, the governor there, who was also considered a potential running mate for John McCain, kept the polls open and extended time for the early voting. Some of the Republicans didn't like that because they thought that would favor the Democrats in Florida.
It was probably a good political move for Crist in general, maybe not so much for the Republican Party, maybe not specifically for John McCain, but again, remember who was on that very short list for vice presidential nomination. Charlie Crist was one of those names that we really thought it was going to trend to. So he really didn't feel like he owed McCain a lot, perhaps, but in terms of making it more accessible, probably a good idea.
Well, we're going to talk to Jim O'Connor throughout this long night of campaigning.
Go away, Jim.
Don't go away, and stay tuned. We'll be back.
And talking more about people voting.
Well, Jim is here with us now, and let's start with the Florida. 10% of the precincts reporting. That's still, even though Obama is leading, that's still early in the evening before you can make a call.
It is, unless you know exactly where
precincts.
Exactly, which counties are coming in, which precincts are coming in, and at what percentages, and then balance it against the rest of the state. It's really difficult to project how the whole state would go. Something, for example, we talked a minute ago about Indiana. You look at the big urban areas like Gary, Indiana, and Indianapolis. Those are traditionally going to go more Barack Obama. surrounded by rural areas that are going to be more pro-McCain. So unless you really know which cities are coming in, it's hard to project forward.
Yeah, they're saying disregard any early returns if Gary is not included, a community with a primarily African-American population. But interesting that Indiana is that close, I guess, Jim. Maybe we're getting too excited this early on, but interesting because that's been seen as an early indicator of how the night could play out again.
It has, and to this point, again, with the consideration that it is early, it does look like it's probably a good indicator for Obama.
You know, George Bush won Indiana with over 20 points back in, I think, in 2004, 21 points. This would be huge if McCain does not take Indiana.
Absolutely. Again, let's...
And Barack Obama campaigned there even today. You know, his next-door neighboring state. He went there today to still try and push to get that vote out for him in Indiana.
One of the political considerations that the Obama camp made in moving into these traditionally red states is not only that they wanted to win them, but it's a tactic, it's a strategy to make your opponent spend money there, to make them spend time there that they could more effectively use elsewhere. So even if they didn't think they could take the state, though in this case I think Obama thought he had a real chance and probably does.
Jim, I was interested, we talked about this earlier, the fact that there's a lot of campaigning on Election Day, not the traditional MO, but we're certainly seeing it now.
Exactly. You had said earlier that one of McCain's favorite things to do on Election Day rather than campaign is to watch a movie. We typically don't see presidential candidates out on the stump on Election Day. They usually have a photo op in the morning when they vote, that plays all day, and that's the end. But I think it's an indication of how close both of these men think that this race is in particular battleground states, that they continue to hammer home their themes.
We were talking about Indiana again. Barack Obama had 47 field offices in one state in the state of Indiana. We have some other projections here, and Illinois, not a surprise, goes to native son there. Barack Obama is declared a winner in the state of Illinois.
Thank you, Chris, and we're with Jim O'Connor. Basically, if you begin to look at the math here, how does it look? I mean, can McCain pull this off? Is it even mathematically possible?
With each new state that's coming in, it looks increasingly desperate for the McCain camp. The numbers just don't add up to that 270 unless, as we continue to move westward, as those new polls close, McCain's camp is able to steal away some of those blue states and turn them red. That's never been their strategy, so that would be a surprise if that does turn out happening. But at the current trajectory, it looks like Barack Obama is definitely on his way to reaching that number, and McCain's options are dwindling. It really is looking less and less possible, like he's able to make up the ground.
And we're showing a lot of the state totals as we talk with you, Jim, about the developments that Chris just mentioned. Let's talk about Georgia. They really put a lot of effort into Georgia. The early voting effort was very big in Georgia. The Barack Obama people thought that they had a good shot at taking Georgia, and here tonight it went to McCain.
That is a surprise, that and Tennessee in particular, because they both have very large African-American populations, and because Barack Obama is getting such huge percentages of the African-American vote, they really thought that that would overwhelm the percentages and that he would be able to switch those states. Apparently he hasn't been able to do that. There was also an interesting Senate race in Georgia with Saxby Chambliss.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Oh, there's the full screen there.
Who, as we were talking about before, really utilized negative campaigning successfully. He went against Max Cleland years ago and portrayed a Vietnam veteran and a hero as a terrorist, very, very boldly on television, and won.
A state rep who was on the Democratic side. He got a lot of money from the Democratic National Committee. Then again, with all the Obama money that went into Georgia, and we don't know the finals on that race yet, that Senate race, but it is telling that the state itself has flipped for McCain.
And it looks like even in the early returns that Saxby Chambliss is ahead of his opponent, so he may actually ride McCain's coattails in Georgia specifically.
And of course, the Senate is hoping, the Democrats are hoping that they can get this 60-vote filibuster-proof vote for the Senate, and with Mitch McConnell keeping Kentucky, and if Chambliss does in fact keep Georgia, those are going to be votes on the Republican side that the Democrats thought they might have a shot at tonight. So
we forget that somehow because we talk so much about the top of the ticket, the presidential, the vice presidential, that there is this struggle to retain control or flip control of the Senate and the House, that the entire House is up for re-election, that a third of the Senate is up up for re-election tonight. And there are some really high-profile Senate races in particular. We just talked about Liddy Dole losing tonight. Saxby-Chambliss holding on. We look to Minnesota as going to be one of the next states that we're going to be talking about, with Norm Coleman, who's the incumbent, running against Al Franken, the comedian from Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, we talked about this earlier, Jim, and it bears repeating. I mean, the fact that it maybe goes strongly in Obama's direction, you're not concerned that that's going to hurt West Coast votes, people turning out before the polls close, figuring, you know, why bother? You don't think that's an issue?
I think the balance of this being such a historic election, no matter who you're supporting in it, is enough to drive people out to the polls. Everyone really seems to be to take part in this year for the first time in a long time.
And Prop 8 is one of the issues that we've been talking about, essentially a ban on same-sex marriage, and yes, one of the most contentious issues in the state. KRON-4's Dan Kerman is live at the headquarters for No on 8. That's at San Francisco.
Even when you go back to the days of Ann Richards when she was the governor, it was still largely a Republican, you know, pretty much of a Republican state, even under her. Yeah.
She was one of those kind of bright Democratic spots that shone out from red territory. It is one of those nights, though, where it's not so much Bush territory anymore. It's the first time that he really hasn't been on the ballot, President Bush, in one way, shape.
Did not campaign, and actually has kind of been so low-key. We've not seen, in fact, Cheney just endorsed McCain a couple days ago, and there were some who said maybe they didn't even necessarily want that endorsement, but we've not heard much from President Bush at all.
Been virtually invisible, really, Jim, hasn't he?
He absolutely has, and I think that's by design, because he is so violently unpopular these days.
So what are you looking at now, since there's not much suspense left in the presidential race? What are you watching with interest at this point in the evening?
Really looking at the Senate, the balance of the Senate. The Democrats have regained control of it, but by how much? I think the margins become very interesting and important as we move forward, seeing if the Democrats are going to be able to reach that magic 60 number, the filibuster-proof number. Easier said than
it doesn't roll off the tongue.
And in the House to see how many seats are gained for the Democrats. It looks like they're going to have a big night as well.
Again, let's go back to the whole issue that Indiana nor Florida have come in yet. Will that make much of a shift? What does that mean?
Mathematically, again, it really isn't going to impact the race for McCain. I think mathematically he's exhausted his possibilities, and we're really just waiting for the rest of the polls to close to announce what everyone already thinks they know. But what those two indicate is that Florida has always gone back and forth. It's kind of perennially one of those battleground states. It kind of comes down blue or red. But Indiana has such a history of going red that for it to be this close that they really can't call it for hours after the polls have closed is indicative of a big Barack Obama movement, whether he wins or loses it.
Yeah, I was just saying to you what's taking them so long, but obviously closer than anticipated, bottom line.
I think we're just here. Did you say Mississippi is coming in? All right, let's see. Mississippi is expected
solidly red states for decades now are up for grabs. In some other states, Barack Obama was successful turning from red to blue.
What's really interesting is when you overlay tonight's map with the 2004 Bush-Kerry map, because we've seen Barack Obama's really ingenious campaign plan at this point come to fruition. We've seen 7 formerly red states switch over tonight. There hasn't been a single red state or blue state that's gone red. So his campaign has achieved exactly what they wanted to. We see that reflected in their landslide electoral victory. We see a huge margin, 5 in the national polls for the popular vote. Really, really impressive.
Some of them southern states, which, you know, the Democrats had not really focused on southern states, and they lost 2 elections back to back, largely, many say, because of that. Howard Dean, the head of the DNC, came on board saying, you know what, we're going to do a 50-state strategy this time, and the Obama campaign took that and ran with it, and it worked.
There are 2 things. One, Gore and Kerry, the last 2 to run against President Bush, really didn't think they could play effectively in these places. It was Howard Dean that first said he wanted to do this 50-state strategy. And really, when you look at the primary, it was Hillary Clinton. Because she stayed in the race for so long, she forced Barack Obama to build networks and organizations in each and every state across the country. So that really gave him a leg up. John McCain, by distinction, was decided relatively early in the process, and he didn't have that chance.
I was going to tell both of you that the wires are saying that more than 1,000 people have flocked to the White House now and surrounding streets.
Really?
And they're honking horns and they're jumping up and down and celebrating Obama's victory. It's always interesting, I think, to watch the honeymoon period for a new president. Any thoughts on how extensive that might be for Barack Obama?
I suppose in large part that's up to the press, and he seems to have an extraordinarily close and warm relationship with the press at this point. So from tonight we have 77 days till the transition of power, and there's a lot of work to be done in terms of the actual transition.
And every move will be under a microscope.
Absolutely.
There are the expectations. He tried to tamp down some of the expectations during his speech tonight, I thought, by saying, you know, that we have a lot to do. I'm going to need your help. It might not happen in 1 year. It might not even happen in 1 term, he said, which was interesting.
Opening the door for yet another run.
Opening the door and also saying, you know, I know you guys, I've told you a lot of things I'm going to do. I might not be able to do that all right away. You know, a lot of times we've looked at our presidents and said, what are you doing in the first 100 days? I don't imagine that he's going to want to take that route this time.
And I think he's going to learn very, very quickly that there is a very real difference between campaigning and governing. If we all think back to that movie, The Candidate, with Robert Redford, you know, the entire build-up is him running for office and all of the...
What was the last line? Now what do we do?
Yeah, he looks at his campaigners and now what do we do?
And they didn't really know.
And there's no real answer, so I think he's going to find out very, very quickly.
I was going to say, going back to Chris Murphy, I think, for something. Chris.
This is a KRON-4 Decision 2008 special.